seat. Speakers, please rise. Senator Ancheta, and is that pronunciation correct?
It's actually Ancheta, sir.
Senator Ancheta, please correct me on any pronunciation mistakes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Senator Jason Ancheta, representing the state of Texas. For the convenience of the judges in the back, it's spelled Ancheta. Again, it's spelled Ancheta. And then please just give me a thumbs up when you're ready for me to begin speaking. All right, this side is good. Awesome. This side is good. All right, awesome. And then Mr. Chair and Parliamentarian. Awesome. All right. Colleagues, you guys good? Senators, looking out across every single person who's sitting in the seats of this Congress, I see not just a Congress, but the next installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In fact, as we start looking out, I realize that it's not just Thanos that can snap his fingers and make his problems disappear. It's this Congress. That's why, as we start looking towards today's legislation, number F4, to end corruption in the Northern Triangle, what we find is that we should be passing today's legislation. So please stand with me and support today's legislation. But we stand in support of today's legislation for a couple of reasons. First among those being the fact that when you start looking towards the current situation, we're trying to alleviate a lot of human rights abuses that we find in the status quo. But then second, what we also need to remember is that in addition to this, we need to try and make sure that we're promoting a government that can solve these issues on their own. It's with these two issues in mind that we stand in support of today's legislation on the affirmation. So first, when we start looking towards the problem as it exists right now, we refer to Médecins Sans Frontières, aka Doctors Without Borders, in their report entitled Forced to Flee Central America's Northern Triangle, a Neglected Humanitarian Crisis. This is a report that they published in May of 2017, which specifically outlines that an estimated 500,000 people cross into Mexico every single year from El Salvador, Honduras, as well as Guatemala. And we find that for the millions of people from the NTCA region, we find trauma, fear, as well as horrific violence. And these are dominant facets of everyday life. So it's not just something that ends when they do reach Mexico. In fact, the report furthers when they tell us that the migration route makes refugees prey to a couple of things, among those being criminal organizations, and sometimes with the tacit approval or complicity of national authorities, as well as the fact that they're subject to violence and abuses like abduction, theft, as well as extortion, torture, and rape. So as we find it right now in the situation that we're trying to deal with, obviously there's a lot of human rights abuses going on. But it doesn't just stop there, because this time we refer to an article from Mr. Jim Patterson with Research News at Vanderbilt University. He tells us on October 3rd of 2017 that when we start looking at the concerns about crime, more than 65% of parents within the area of the Northern Triangle have prevented their children from playing outside, as well as being unsupervised during the past year. But then furthermore, this is extended when we look towards the Latin America Public Opinion Project survey from September of 2017, when they tell us that citizens stay home at night and avoid public transport because they're afraid of being crime victims. People shouldn't live in fear like this. That's why this United States Congress uses this piece of legislation to, like we stated earlier, snap our fingers to hopefully try and alleviate the issue. But it doesn't just stop there. The second reason why you pass today's legislation is because when we start looking towards Mr. Douglas Farah, he tells us that the state with shrinking resources and hollowed out structures is in retreat. So by passing today's legislation, this Congress stands in support of the change that we want to see. So stand with me in support.
Thank you, Speaker. 3 minutes, 10 seconds. Questioners, please rise. McFeely, Shaw, Dwar, Jacobson.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
So ultimately, why is it that you believe that this legislation, which specifically targets high levels of corruption in the higher echelons of these governments, is going to be more effective than in developing infrastructure in these areas?
So right now, what we're finding with these governments is the fact that they just can't deal with the problem. So because of that, the specific target of this legislation is looking at those actors. Now, I know where you're coming from, but in the long run, I'm hoping that by passing today's legislation, it gives us that infrastructure and sets the precedent that we can see to help build
How does this
infrastructure in the
legislation
future.
provide infrastructure rather than just targeting corruption?
Senator Shaw.
Hi, Senator. So
Hi.
let's discuss the specifics of the piece of legislation as
Yes.
an affirmation speaker. Now, let's first discuss about subsection A. So within that, it says that it's going to target local jurisdictions. So why is that
Yes.
effective?
So local jurisdictions have proven to be more effective
What's
than
an
the
example?
national government. What was
What's
it?
an example of that?
So an example is when we find that, like these NGOs
In a
working with
country.
local, when we specifically look at that report, they tell us that specifically looking at El Salvador, when Doctors Without Borders works
Salvador.
with a local
Or
provision,
how is that similar to something I've seen in
Senator
the United
Dwar.
Okay, so where's most of the corruption inside Central American countries centered right now?
central government.
Okay, so knowing that, and if those governments are corrupt, how can local governments have any power standing up to them?
Because the local governments are the ones within their jurisdictions making a difference in the
Okay,
community.
but if the central government is just going to shut down their power, again, how do they have jurisdiction?
But the cool thing about that is that we have associations like Doctors Without Borders that give them more of a presence in the communities as opposed to the central government.
so how well has that been working right now?
Senator Jacobson.
Hi, good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
So, you talk a lot about the grievances under the current conditions in the Northern Triangle. I'm just wondering what today's legislation actually does.
So it gives us the support that we need within the region
How?
to set up that infrastructure because it shows us that on the international stage we're going to make a difference.
Alright,
it doesn't
so-
necessarily have to be like a specific
Okay,
action,
can I
but it's
mention
the
something?
Yeah, sure.
Right, so in Section 1A, it mentions the Kingpin Narcotic Act in
Sure.
addition to the Magnitsky International Act. So what do those specifically do, and who are the known violators?
It
Thank
just
you,
shows that
Speaker.
we'll target it.
The Speaker may be seated.
I thank the chair.
Senator Ancheta, your placard.